Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. It does not depict real people events or official military actions. I was still in uniform when the rain finally eased my hands stiff on the wheel after 14 hours of moving supplies up and down the coast pallets counted twice. Manifests signed radios crackling with updates about flooded roads and stalled convoys. October storms in Virginia have a way of settling into your bones, and that night on Route 58, the wind shoved my vehicle sideways as if it had a say in where I should go. I remember thinking only about getting home to Norfolk about hot water and silence when the headlights caught something wrong on the shoulder ahead. A dark sedan sat at an angle hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain steam lifting from the hood. I slowed without deciding to. Training tells you to assess to keep moving unless ordered, but training also tells you to really look. I saw a man waving with one arm and shielding a child with the other, a woman pressed against the passenger window, her face pale and tight. The radio hissed with a warning about delays. I shut it off. I pulled over. The wind slapped my door as I stepped out, rain soaking my sleeves, boots slipping in the grit. The engine was done. The family was stuck. The nearest open station was miles away. I knew the line I was crossing, and I crossed it anyway, not to be brave, but because leaving them there felt worse. I called it non-combat aid in my head, something that did not need permission to be human. I got them into my vehicle, wrapped the kid in a spare jacket, drove them to a lit station where the clerk had coffee and a phone. The mother kept saying thank you like it was a prayer. The father squeezed my hand with a grip that shook. I did not give my name. I drove away before the storm could change its mind. By the time I reached my street, the rain had thinned to a cold mist, the porch light already on like an accusation. My stepdad was waiting arms crossed, posture perfect, even in a doorway, the kind of stillness that dares you to move first. He did not ask if I was safe. He did not ask why I was late. He said my name the way officers do when they have decided you are wrong. He said I had embarrassed him. He said I had stepped outside my place. I stood there dripping on the mat heart still thudding from the road and listened as he listed what I had risked: my reputation, my future, the image of order he valued above all else. I realized then that the storm had not followed me home. It had been waiting here. I thought of the child's hands clutching the jacket and felt something settle, a calm that comes when the line is already crossed. He leaned closer, voice low and sharp, asking what I thought I was doing. I looked past him into the house I grew up in and understood that whatever came next would not be small. Not for him, not for me. Would you have stopped that night? I did not grow up in a house where voices were raised often, which made the silences louder. My mother remarried when I was 13, a year after my biological father died. Suddenly, the kind of death that leaves no time for last words and no space to prepare a child for what comes next. Richard Callahan entered our lives with a firm handshake, a careful smile, and rules that arrived before affection. At the time, he was already an Army officer on a fast track. Though I did not understand ranks then, only that doors opened for him and people straightened when he entered rooms. He believed order was love and obedience was respect. My mother believed stability would heal what grief had broken. I learned early that asking for space sounded like ingratitude and that quiet compliance kept the peace. Richard was not cruel in obvious ways. He did not hit or shout. He measured, he corrected, he compared. When I brought home a good grade, he asked why it was not better. When I helped around the house, he reminded me it was expected. When his biological son visited on weekends, rules bent like warm wire. Mistakes were explained away. Excuses were accepted. I learned to watch the scales tip and not comment. Favoritism does not announce itself, it accumulates. It taught me self-reliance, not because I was told to be strong, but because strength was the only way to be unseen. By 16, I had a part-time job and a plan to leave. I ran track because movement quieted my thoughts. I took late shifts because money meant independence. I learned to do things right the first time because asking twice felt like begging. When recruiters came to school with polished brochures, I did not feel sold to, I felt recognized. The Army offered structure without personal debt standards that applied to everyone, and a promise that effort would be measured by something other than family standing. My mother cried when I told her I was enlisting. Richard nodded as if approving a form. He asked what MOS I wanted and warned me logistics was invisible work. I chose it anyway. Supply chains keep people alive. I shipped out at 21 with a duffel and a spine that had learned to hold itself straight. Training stripped away what did not matter and reinforced what did. Be early. Be accurate. Take responsibility even when no one is watching. I found comfort in systems that worked because they had to, not because someone powerful liked you. Over 11 years, I moved through bases and ports, learned to read weather reports like a language learned that a late delivery could cost more than money. I did not chase glory. I chased consistency. Promotions came on schedule. Evaluations were clean. No scandals, no reprimands, no whispered warnings. I became the officer people trusted to fix what broke at 2 a.m. I called my mother weekly. Richard listened on speaker and corrected details as if my life were a briefing. He reminded me to remember who I represented. I reminded myself to remember who I was. The favoritism never disappeared, it simply evolved. When his son faltered, Richard explained pressure. When I succeeded, he attributed discipline he believed he had instilled. I stopped arguing with ghosts. Logistics fit me because it rewarded preparation and punished ego. You could not bluff a manifest. You could not outrank a storm. I learned to lead without spectacle to protect my people by planning 3 steps ahead. I learned that trust is built when you do what you say every time, especially when it is boring. By my 30s, I was a captain with 11 years behind me and a reputation that preceded me quietly. Colleagues knew I would take the late convoy and the early call. Superiors knew I would deliver bad news cleanly and good news without celebration. I did not cut corners. I documented everything. Not because I was afraid, but because records tell the truth when voices cannot. At home, the dynamic remained fixed. Richard spoke of the army as if it were his alone. He spoke of sacrifice as if it were a currency he controlled. He spoke of loyalty as if it flowed upward. I listened and filed the words away. My mother tried to bridge us with dinners and holidays, her smiles careful, her hopes brittle. I loved her enough not to make scenes. I loved myself enough not to bend. The night of the storm did not come from recklessness. It came from years of choosing the thing that lets you sleep. I had earned trust the slow way by showing up and staying steady when no one was watching. That is what made the accusation on my porch land so hard. It was not just that Richard questioned my judgment. It was that he dismissed the foundation of my life with a sentence. He believed authority defined right and wrong. I believed actions did. The distance between those beliefs had always existed. That night, it finally became visible. The questions started the next morning, not shouted, not dramatic, but arranged like a checklist he intended to complete. Richard waited until my mother left for work, then called me into the kitchen where the coffee had gone untouched and the radio was off. He asked me to recount the storm minute by minute, where I stopped, how long I stayed, who I contacted, what I said. His tone was clinical, as if the night had been an exercise and I had failed to annotate my steps. When I answered plainly, he interrupted to correct my phrasing, insisting on words that made it sound worse. Unauthorized, deviation, exposure. He asked why I thought my judgment mattered more than protocol. I said it did not matter more, it mattered alongside it. His mouth tightened. He told me I did not understand the system. He said the army ran on order, not impulse, and that there were things larger than kindness. He repeated that line until it felt rehearsed. There are things larger than kindness. I recognized it from childhood, the way he used abstractions to end conversations. I asked who I had embarrassed. He said him. He said the family. He said people would talk. I asked which people. He waved a hand and said it did not matter that perception was reality when rank was involved. That word landed differently. Rank. He had not used it with me before, not directly. He had always spoken as if the institution were an idea he guarded. Now he spoke as if it were a lever he could pull. He warned me that reports travel, that narratives form, that once a story settles, it is hard to move. He said he could not protect me if I insisted on being naive. Protect. The word made my shoulders square. I asked, protect me from what? He said consequences. He said I was lucky he found out first. He said anyone else would have made an example. I thought of my evaluations, my spotless record, the calls I had logged during the storm. I asked him which regulation I had violated. He did not cite one. He circled back to the idea of optics to the danger of setting a precedent. He asked whether I wanted younger officers to think feelings trumped orders. I said I wanted them to think people mattered. He said that was not how the world worked. I noticed then how carefully he avoided specifics and how often he returned to authority as a substitute for explanation. When my mother came home that evening, the air felt rehearsed. Richard summarized my actions for her with edits that sharpened the edges. She looked between us, uncertain, asking if anyone had been hurt. "No," he said, "but it could have been worse." He reminded her of his career of sacrifices made of the weight of leadership. She nodded because nodding had become a habit. Later, alone in my room, I pulled my notes and checked the timestamps I had recorded out of reflex. I listened to the dash audio again. I replayed the memory of the clerk handing me a cup of coffee and the mother whispering thank you. None of it fit the catastrophe he described. The next day, he called twice while I was at work, asking whether I had told anyone else whether my command knew whether I had put anything in writing. Each question felt less like concern and more like containment. He told me again that I did not understand the system, that there were ladders you climbed quietly and lines you did not cross. I asked him which line I crossed. He said the one that embarrassed him. That was the moment suspicion took shape. Not a spike, a slow alignment of pieces. He was not worried about safety. He was worried about control. He was not correcting an error. He was managing a narrative. I started paying attention to what he did not say. He did not ask about the family. He did not ask whether the child was okay. He did not ask whether I was hurt. He asked about visibility. He asked about rank. He asked about fallout. At work, I mentioned the night to a colleague in logistics, keeping it neutral. She raised an eyebrow and said it sounded like non-combat assistance and asked if I had logged it. I said yes. She shrugged and said then, "You are fine." Her certainty unsettled me more than Richard's certainty had. On my drive home, I replayed his phrases. "There are things larger than kindness. You do not understand the system." I realized he had used those lines before, whenever my choices did not center him. Suspicion is not anger. It is clarity arriving quietly. I began to document not because I intended to fight, but because truth likes company. I noted dates and calls. I saved messages. I asked neutral questions and listened to the answers stretch. Mid-week, he sat me down again and suggested I take leave. Keep my head down, let things cool. He said visibility was dangerous for people without protection. I asked if he was offering protection. He said family always looks out for its own, then added that loyalty went both ways. The implication sat between us. I thought of every time I had swallowed a slight to keep peace. I thought of the child's hands clutching a jacket. I felt the difference between obedience and integrity sharpen. Have you ever been punished for doing the right thing? The question formed before I realized it had words. That night, I lay awake and accepted what my instincts had already mapped. This was not about a storm. It was about who gets to decide what right looks like and who pays when that decision is challenged. The punishment did not arrive in a memo or a counseling statement, and that was the first lie I had to name for myself. It came in conversations that left no paper trail in tone and timing, in the way doors closed just before I reached them. Richard never claimed authority over my command and never needed to. He knew how pressure moves without fingerprints. It started with words meant to shrink me. He called my decision reckless and childish, said it betrayed a hunger for attention I did not have. He suggested I had put myself above the institution and implied that kind of vanity always reveals itself eventually. When I responded with facts, he laughed softly and said facts do not save you when narratives turn. He told me people remember embarrassment longer than explanations. He asked whether I wanted to be known as difficult. He said difficult officers stall careers. He said I had always been stubborn and that stubbornness reads as disloyalty when rank is watching. Each sentence was delivered calmly, as if he were doing me a favor by telling the truth others would not. I felt the ground tilt, not because I believed him, but because I recognized the pattern from childhood, the way he framed harm as guidance and expected gratitude in return. The next step was reputation. He hinted that my judgment would be questioned in spaces I could not enter. He named committees without naming names, reviews without dates. He said stories travel faster than corrections. He said he had heard concerns already and that my silence would be read as admission if I did not learn when to stop talking. I asked who had concerns. He said that was not important and warned me against forcing his hand. The phrase landed cold. He wanted me to understand that proximity is power, that relationships do the work before rules ever need to. When my mother tried to intervene, he spoke over her gently and reminded her of the sacrifices he had made for stability the nights away, the weight of command. He said he was protecting the family from embarrassment. I watched her shoulders fold in the familiar way and felt a hollow open where trust used to sit. The pressure widened beyond our house. An old family friend stopped returning my calls. A mentor from early in my career suggested I keep my head down and focus on routine tasks for a while. No one accused me outright. They did not have to. The message was ambient, the kind that hums until you adjust your steps to avoid it. Richard suggested I withdraw from a speaking slot at a logistics workshop, said it would look provocative. He advised me to skip a community event where uniforms draw attention. He said visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites mistakes. Each suggestion carried the weight of warning. Each warning carried the promise that he could make it worse if I resisted. I felt anger rise and pass without expression. Reacting would have given him what he wanted. I learned that punishment can be most effective when it provokes you to punish yourself. He pressed hardest on loyalty. He said family closes ranks and asked why I seemed eager to test him. He reminded me that I had benefited from his name, even if I pretended not to. He claimed credit for my discipline, for my patience, for the very restraint I was using to stand there quietly. He said I owed him discretion. I realized then how betrayal works. It borrows your virtues and uses them against you. I did not argue. I did not plead. I listened and recorded the cadence of his words in my memory. He called me naive again and again as if repetition would make it true. He said kindness is indulgent and indulgence undermines order. He said leaders make hard choices and that my choice had been easy because it was sentimental. The dismissal cut deeper than anger would have. He framed compassion as weakness and assumed I would accept the label to avoid conflict. I let the silence stretch. He took my quiet as agreement and pressed further, saying he would be disappointed if I forced him to escalate. Escalate to what he did not specify. The lack of specificity was the point. Fear thrives in blanks. The final insult arrived wrapped as concern. He told me to consider my future, to think about the long arc, to remember that institutions have memories. He said reputations are built slowly and lost in moments. He said he would hate to see my work overshadowed by one bad story. One bad story. The phrase rang false. There had been no story until he started telling it. I left those conversations feeling smaller, not because I believed him, but because I recognized the cost of resisting someone who measures winning by compliance. At work, I did my job with the same precision as always. I delivered on time. I corrected errors. I took responsibility. I did not mention the pressure because naming it prematurely would have turned it into noise. Inside, something shifted from confusion to resolve. The betrayal was not that he disagreed with me. It was that he weaponized intimacy and access to bend me. It was that he taught me again that affection in our house had always been conditional. I felt grief settle where anger might have been the kind that comes when an illusion finally gives way. I stopped expecting fairness from him and started expecting strategy. I wrote nothing down in places he could reach. I kept my notes factual and sparse. I memorized his phrases and the order he used them because patterns tell you where pressure will go next. I understood that he believed my restraint meant surrender. He mistook discipline for fear. The disillusionment was clean and complete. I no longer wondered if I had done the right thing. I wondered only how far he would go to ensure I paid for it. Silence became my shelter, not the empty kind that hides fear, but the deliberate kind that keeps your footing when the ground tilts. I stopped explaining myself to Richard and stopped trying to rescue my mother from choices she had made long before that storm. At work, I spoke only to the extent the mission required. I answered emails cleanly, returned calls promptly, and let my record do what it had always done. In the quiet hours, I documented. Not a diary, not a narrative, just facts arranged so they could stand on their own. Dates, times, locations, weather advisories issued that night along Route 58, dispatch notes about closures and hazards. I pulled my own vehicle logs and confirmed the timestamps that showed when I slowed, when I stopped, when I resumed. I requested the traffic camera clips through the routine channels we use for after-action reviews, careful to keep the request neutral. The footage showed what memory already knew: the sedan angled wrong, the hazard lights flickering, the rain slanting so hard it looked like static. It showed my vehicle pulling over without drama, no sirens, no spectacle. It showed a child bundled into a jacket and a family moving toward light. I did not annotate motives. I let the images speak. I checked call records next. The clerk had called for assistance at the station and logged the arrival. The time matched. I cross-referenced the storm bulletins and the warnings about hypothermia, risk for stranded motorists. Each piece fit without forcing. I asked questions of colleagues the way logisticians do, indirectly focused on process. If a vehicle stops to render aid during severe weather, what do we log? Who do we notify? Where does it sit in the system? The answers were consistent. Document and move on. Non-combat assistance under hazardous conditions is not misconduct. It is context. One senior NCO asked why I was asking, and I said I wanted to make sure my team knew the right steps if they ever faced it. He nodded and said good leaders prepare people for the gray areas. That word stayed with me. Gray. At home, the pressure continued in softer forms. Richard stopped criticizing directly and started praising restraint, telling me he was glad I had come to my senses. He said keeping quiet showed maturity. He said storms pass if you do not stir the water. I thanked him and did not correct the assumption. I began to see how much he relied on me to argue so he could frame me as emotional. Without my reaction, his story had nowhere to land. I kept my phone face down during dinners and left early when conversations curved toward control. I memorized his phrasing when he spoke about rank and influenced the casual way he named rooms I would never enter. I noticed how often he said he could help if I listened. Help was the lever. I removed myself from its reach. At work, I reviewed our standard operating procedures for severe weather convoys and updated a checklist for my team. It included a line about human safety considerations phrased plainly, nothing preachy. I circulated it and asked for feedback. No one objected. In fact, a junior officer thanked me for clarifying what had always felt vague. I kept that email, not as proof, but as context. Proof convinces opponents. Context convinces systems. I requested the maintenance logs for my vehicle and verified there were no anomalies that could be twisted into negligence. I reviewed my last 3 evaluations and noted the language used to describe judgment and discretion. I asked a trusted mentor to walk me through how narratives get tested when they reach oversight. He said the same thing twice. Timelines matter. Documentation matters. Calm matters. He told me not to rush and not to dramatize. Let escalation reveal itself. That night alone, I laid everything out on the table and felt a steadiness return. I was not building a case against a person. I was assembling a mirror. If someone wanted to claim my actions were reckless, the mirror would reflect conditions. If someone wanted to suggest impropriety, the mirror would reflect procedure. Silence, I learned, is not the absence of voice. It is choosing when and where your voice will carry weight. Richard sensed the shift. He asked fewer questions and watched more closely. He told my mother I was being stubborn again. She told me to be careful. I told her I was. That was true. Careful is not quiet surrender. Careful is knowing that escalation favors the prepared. In the days that followed, I felt the pull to confront him and resisted it. The urge to correct a lie is strong, especially when it wears a familiar face. But confrontation would have been a gift. I kept my routine intact and my posture neutral. When he hinted that he might speak to someone on my behalf, I thanked him and said it would not be necessary. The surprise on his face confirmed what I suspected. He expected me to ask for protection. I would not. I trusted the work I had done and the work I was doing. The storm had taught me something simple. You do not argue with weather. You prepare for it. As the pressure gathered and the air went still, I asked myself the only question that mattered. What would you do next? Allies do not arrive with fanfare. They arrive when your preparation makes room for them. The first was quiet and procedural. An email from the Inspector General office responded to a routine inquiry I had sent days earlier, a neutral request for clarification on documentation standards during severe weather assistance. The reply did not accuse or alarm. It asked for a brief meeting to ensure alignment. The tone mattered. It assumed good faith. When I sat across from the IG officer in a small office with no windows and a clock that ticked too loudly, he listened more than he spoke. He asked me to walk through the night on Route 58 and interrupted only to confirm dates and references. He asked whether anyone outside my chain had contacted me about the incident. I answered carefully and truthfully. He nodded and wrote nothing for a long moment. Then he said the words that shifted the room. "This is not discipline. This is abuse." He explained the difference with precision. Discipline corrects conduct through defined processes. Abuse pressures outcomes through proximity and fear. One is documented and accountable. The other hides. He did not ask me to file a complaint. He told me I could if pressure continued. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Document. Stay calm. Do not retaliate. He said systems respond to clarity. Before I left, he looked at me and said quietly that storms reveal leadership and that my record spoke for itself. The second ally arrived closer to home, where I least expected relief. Colonel James Whitaker lived 2 houses down a retired Army officer who walked his dog at dawn and waved without intruding. I had known him as a neighbor for years, exchanging pleasantries and borrowing tools. One evening as I returned from work, he was in his yard, watching the sky bruise with clouds. He asked about the storm, and I answered briefly. He listened and then asked a question no one else had asked. "How did it feel when you got home?" I paused and told him the truth without detail. He did not press. He told me he had seen this before: officers confusing influence with authority and families confusing loyalty with silence. He said retirement gives you perspective and removes fear. Then he repeated the line the IG officer had used without knowing it. "This is not discipline. This is abuse." Hearing it twice made it real. He warned me not to underestimate how quickly pressure can escalate when it is not checked by daylight. He told me to keep my notes factual and my tone flat. He offered to stand as a witness if needed, not to events, but to character, to years of watching me work without spectacle. He said, reputations built quietly are harder to dismantle than reputations built loudly. We talked about logistics, about storms, about how systems fail when people treat them like weapons. When I went inside, I felt something I had not felt since the porch confrontation: support without conditions. At home, Richard sensed the shift again. He softened, spoke of reconciliation, suggested we put the storm behind us. I agreed without committing. He mentioned calling in favors, and I declined politely. The pressure paused, not because it ended, but because it met resistance it did not understand. With the IG guidance and the colonel's perspective, my silence sharpened into strategy. I stopped wondering whether I was alone. I was not. The system had edges, and those edges had names. I did not need to push yet. I needed to wait until the weather changed. The investigation did not announce itself with urgency or accusation, which was how I knew it was real. It began with alignment requests and calendar holds with subject lines that read "review and verification" rather than inquiry. I was asked to provide a precise timeline, and I did, starting with the weather advisories issued on October 19, 2023, the near Easter remnants that pushed rain bands inland and closed stretches along Route 58. I included the logistics duty order that placed me on the road that night, the convoy manifest stamped at 0600, the completion time logged at 1945, and the vehicle assignment tied to my badge number. I listed the moment I reduced speed due to standing water at mile marker 112, the moment the hazard lights came into view at 113, and the moment I stopped at 113 and 38 seconds confirmed by my vehicle telemetry. I provided the dash camera file and the traffic camera clip obtained through routine channels, both timestamped and unedited. The investigators asked for call logs, and I delivered them without commentary. The outgoing call to station services at 1:14, the clerk-initiated call to local assistance at 1:16, the inbound confirmation at 1:21. I attached the weather bulletin warning of hypothermia risk for stranded motorists. and the local closure notice that placed the nearest open facility more than 10 miles away. The questions stayed procedural. Who authorized the stop? What notification was made? How long did the assistance last? I answered without embellishment. No authorization was sought because no authorization was required for non-combat assistance under hazardous conditions. Notification was made at the first safe opportunity. The assistance lasted 9 minutes and 42 seconds. They asked whether I identified myself by name. I did not. Whether I activated emergency signals. I did not. Whether I accepted anything of value. I did not. They asked whether any cargo integrity was compromised. It was not. They asked whether the mission completion time changed. It did not. Each answer sat on documentation. Emails followed requesting clarification on standard operating procedures, and I attached the relevant excerpts highlighting the language on human safety considerations during severe weather. I included my updated checklist circulated to my team after the storm not as justification, but as evidence of consistency. The investigators requested statements from the station clerk and the responding local officer. Both arrived within 48 hours and aligned on times and conditions. The family was contacted through appropriate channels and confirmed the assistance without naming me, describing the jacket, the vehicle, the direction of travel. The child had been evaluated for exposure and released without complication. The confirmation mattered not for sentiment, but for completeness. A system requires closure. As the file grew, the pressure at home thinned into awkward courtesy. Richard stopped mentioning the storm and began talking about schedules and weather like a man avoiding a bruise. My mother watched me with new attention and asked fewer questions. At work, the investigation remained contained, no rumors, no theatrics. The IG officer checked in once to confirm receipt of materials and once to confirm witness statements. He did not advise me on outcomes. He reminded me to continue routine duties and to avoid contact outside formal channels. I complied. The next phase examined communications around me rather than actions by me. Requests went out for emails and calls that referenced the incident. I was informed of the scope and provided consent where required. The review pulled in messages that had never reached my inbox, conversations about optics and embarrassment, suggestions that my judgment needed guidance. None cited a regulation. None named a corrective action. The language was telling. It spoke of influence and caution rather than process. The investigators mapped the sequence and asked one clarifying question that landed like a pin. When did the pressure begin? I answered with a date and time and attached the call record from my porch that night. The clock does not lie. The file now had 2 timelines that could not be reconciled. One showed an event handled within procedure. The other showed a reaction that preceded any formal review. That discrepancy is where investigations find traction. A system tolerates mistakes. It does not tolerate manipulation. I was asked to attend a verification meeting and did so with the same posture I bring to supply briefings: factual, concise, neutral. The panel asked about my training, my evaluations, my prior conduct. I provided them. 11 years, clean record, logistics specialization, repeated commendations for calm execution under adverse conditions. No deviations, no counseling statements, no warnings. They asked whether I felt pressured. I described behavior without labels, the questions, the warnings about visibility, the suggestions to withdraw from professional engagements. I did not name motives. I named actions. They asked whether the pressure affected my performance. I answered no and provided delivery metrics for the period. They asked whether I had sought protection. I answered no and explained I had sought clarification. The distinction mattered. Clarification invites sunlight. Protection invites dependency. As the meeting closed, the chair thanked me for precision and reminded me that findings would be communicated through proper channels. Days passed, then weeks. During that time, the investigation widened to include oversight beyond my installation, not because of me, but because of the communications uncovered. I learned of this not through gossip, but through a formal notice that a hearing would be scheduled to address procedural concerns identified during review. The language was careful. It did not name individuals yet. It named issues. Influence outside chain. Prejudgment without citation. Attempts to shape narrative. Each phrase was anchored to evidence. The family I had helped faded back into privacy where they belonged. The storm season moved on. My work continued. The colonel down the street nodded when we crossed paths and said nothing more. The IG officer sent a brief note acknowledging the completeness of my submissions. The system had taken hold. I felt no triumph, only relief that facts had weight when carried patiently. When the notice of the hearing arrived with a date and a room number, I read it once and placed it in the folder. It was not revenge moving forward. It was gravity. The hearing room was brighter than I expected, fluorescent lights flattening faces and turning polished wood into something sterile, a place designed to remove drama from decisions that carry weight. Civilian oversight sat alongside uniformed officers' binders, stacked in front of them screens, ready with exhibits cued by numbers rather than names. I took my seat where directed and folded my hands the way I do before a briefing steady and neutral, letting procedure do its work. When the chair called the session to order, the cadence was familiar. Purpose-stated scope defined reminders given about testimony and records. It felt routine until the first name was read. Mine for context. Then the timeline was summarized aloud, October 19th, 2023. Wrote 58. Severe weather advisories, non-combat assistance rendered mission completion unchanged. Exhibits followed camera stills, call logs, bulletins, each item identified and placed into the record. No adjectives, no interpretation. The system speaking in its own language. Then, the chair announced the subject of the communications review, the individual whose messages had prompted expansion. Richard Callahan. The sound of his name landed differently in the room, a slight shift you could feel more than hear. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, posture immaculate, expression set to something between confidence and impatience, the look of a man accustomed to rooms bending around him. The clerk read his affiliation and then read his rank aloud. United States Army General. The word general echoed once and stopped. I did not look at him. I watched the panel. There is a moment when authority changes shape, when it moves from personal gravity to public record. That moment had arrived. The chair outlined the concerns without accusation, referencing communications dated within hours of the incident, language about optics and embarrassment, suggestions to influence participation in professional events, references to protection offered outside formal channels. Each sentence was followed by an exhibit number. The civilian member asked whether any corrective action had been initiated through appropriate command processes. The answer was no. Another member asked whether any regulation had been cited to the affected officer. The answer was no. The chair asked whether the communications occurred before any formal review of the incident. The answer was yes. The room grew quiet in the way rooms do when the shape of a thing becomes clear. Richard requested to speak and was granted time. He stood with the ease of habit and spoke of leadership, of responsibility, of the dangers of precedent. He framed his concern as mentorship and his words as private guidance. He said families advise one another and that he had only sought to protect reputations. He did not deny the messages. He contextualized them. The chair asked him to point to the regulation he believed was violated. He referenced principles rather than paragraphs. The civilian member asked whether those principles authorized him to exert influence outside the chain. He said influence is part of leadership. The uniformed member asked whether leadership includes preemptive narrative shaping. He paused. The pause was recorded. The chair thanked him and called the next item. My name was called again, this time for testimony. I stood and took the oath, the words familiar, the meaning heavier than usual. The questions came in order. Did I stop? Yes. Did I log? Yes. Did I notify? Yes. Did I deviate from mission completion? No. Did anyone in my chain counsel me for misconduct? No. Did anyone outside my chain contact me regarding optics or reputation? Yes. I described the behavior without labels, the questions, the suggestions, the warnings about visibility, the offers of protection. I cited dates and times and referred to exhibits. I was asked how many times I had been contacted. I answered with a number. I was asked how it affected my work. I answered that it did not. I was asked why I had not complained earlier. I answered that I sought clarification and documented facts. The chair asked if I wished to add anything else. This was the moment I had anticipated and prepared for by preparing not to fill it. I spoke once, and only once beyond answering questions. I said that I believed discipline belongs to defined processes and that assistance rendered under hazardous conditions belongs to humanity and procedure together. I said that influence should never substitute for regulation and that silence should never be mistaken for consent. Then I stopped. The room held the silence as if it had weight. No one rushed to fill it. The civilian member leaned back. The uniformed member closed his binder. The chair looked down at the agenda and then up again. Findings were not announced then, as they never are. Process requires distance, but the exposure had already happened. Rank had been read aloud. Messages had been entered. Timelines had been aligned. Authority had been weighed against record and found wanting in specific ways that cannot be smoothed by rhetoric. As the session adjourned, people stood without conversation, the kind of quiet that follows recognition. Richard did not look back. I gathered my folder and walked out into a hallway that felt longer than before. Outside, the sky had cleared into a hard blue that comes after storms when air feels scrubbed. The question formed again, not as accusation, but as reckoning. Was justice finally served? Justice does not arrive with noise. It moves on calendars and signatures and notifications that reference findings and next steps in language that refuses drama because drama clouds outcomes. After the hearing, there was no announcement to celebrate and no verdict to savor. There was process. The oversight panel issued its preliminary findings through formal channels, careful and restrained, concluding that the assistance rendered during the storm complied with procedure, and that subsequent pressure constituted inappropriate influence outside the chain. The words mattered because they were precise. Inappropriate influence, outside the chain. Those phrases carry weight when written by people who do not raise their voices. A parallel review opened automatically, not because anyone wanted spectacle, but because systems are built to respond when thresholds are crossed. The scope widened to communications practices and use of position to whether authority had been implied where none existed. I was notified as a witness, not a complainant. That distinction mattered to me. I had not sought punishment. I had sought accuracy. The months that followed were quiet in public and busy in offices. Interviews were scheduled and rescheduled. Records were requested and produced. Each request tightened the frame. Richard was placed on administrative leave pending review, a neutral phrase that sounds temporary until you understand the machinery behind it. Administrative leave removes access, not dignity, but it stops motion. He could no longer call rooms into order with a glance. He could no longer smooth things over with familiarity. The system did what systems do when left alone to work. It compared statements to records. It compared timing to authority. It measured intent against effect. The findings were issued in stages. First, a determination that his communications violated standards governing influence and impartiality. Then a conclusion that corrective action through informal channels was insufficient given rank and pattern. Then the recommendation, forced retirement under review findings. The phrase landed with a thud that echoed through our family before it echoed anywhere else. Forced retirement is not a spectacle. It is an ending without ceremony, a closing of doors that had always opened. The announcement was internal and restrained. No press release, no public apology, just an update that a general would be retiring effective immediately following administrative action. Reputation does not collapse all at once. It erodes. Invitations stop. Calls go unanswered. Names are omitted from panels. Stories shift from admiration to caution. In spaces that once deferred people, now speak plainly. The record follows you even when you leave the room. I learned this not through gossip, but through absence. The house grew quieter. My mother stopped mentioning schedules and started mentioning weather. Richard stopped offering guidance and started avoiding eye contact. When he did speak, his sentences shortened. He did not argue the findings. He could not. They were built on his own words. At work, the effect was simple and clean. My record was cleared without footnote. The investigation closed with no action required on my part. The language was brief and final. Assistance rendered was appropriate. No misconduct found. I returned to routine duties without fanfare. Colleagues treated me the same, which was the best outcome I could imagine. Justice had not elevated me. It had normalized the truth. That was enough. People asked whether it felt like revenge. I never understood the question. Revenge seeks to hurt. Justice seeks to correct. What happened to Richard was the consequence of choices documented and weighed by people who had no reason to favor me. I did not cheer. I did not gloat. I felt a sober relief that comes when gravity reasserts itself. The system had functioned as designed when given facts and time. The storm that night had forced a choice. The storm afterward had forced accountability. When the retirement became official, there was a family dinner where nothing was said, plates clinked. Weather was discussed. The absence of rank in the room felt strange at first, then ordinary. Authority had returned to where it belongs, to process and purpose rather than proximity. I looked around the table and understood that justice does not restore what favoritism breaks. It draws boundaries so harm does not continue. That was the measure. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Stability. The kind that lets you breathe and return to work, knowing that integrity, when protected by patience, still has a place. He came back when the paperwork had settled and the house had learned a new quiet, the kind that follows endings people pretend were mutual. It was a Sunday afternoon, gray and unremarkable, when the doorbell rang and my mother's footsteps slowed before she reached it. I knew who it would be before she opened the door, because audacity has a rhythm you recognize once you have learned its sound. Richard stood there without insignia and without the practiced authority that used to fill a doorway. He looked smaller, not because age had caught him, but because position had released him. He asked if we could talk. My mother stepped aside out of habit. I did not move. We sat at the table where he had once listed my faults as lessons. He spoke carefully, choosing words like a man negotiating unfamiliar ground. He said retirement was an adjustment. He said the review had been difficult. He said misunderstandings happen when storms force decisions. He said families should heal faster than institutions. Then he asked for a favor. He said there were people who still listened to me, people who respected my record, people who might reconsider if they heard my perspective. He did not ask me to lie. He asked me to contextualize. He asked me to soften edges. He said a word I had not heard from him before. Help. He invoked my mother, my childhood, the years he had supported the household. He said families stand together when the world turns cold. He said I knew how things work. He said I could make a call. I listened the way I had learned to listen, letting sentences reveal their weight. He had not apologized. He had reframed. He had not named harm. He had named inconvenience. He spoke as if justice were weather and not consequence. I watched my mother's hands twist in her lap and felt the old pull to smooth the room. That reflex rose and passed. I asked him one question and waited for the answer. Which part do you want me to change? He frowned and said he wanted fairness. I asked him to define it. He said fairness is remembering loyalty. I said loyalty is not leverage. He tried again, this time with humility practiced like a new language. He said he had made mistakes. He said pressure had clouded judgment. He said he was proud of me. The words arrived late and thin. He reached for my wrist and I moved my hand back to the table. I told him I would not speak for him. He asked why, as if the reason were not sitting between us. I said because the system had already spoken. He said systems can be persuaded. I said not by me. He said family matters. I said yes and looked at him steadily. You already chose who mattered. The sentence did not rise. It landed. The room went quiet in a way that cannot be negotiated. My mother inhaled sharply. Richard stared at the table as if it might offer a different ending. He asked if I would ever forgive him. I said forgiveness is personal and accountability is public, and I would not trade one for the other. He stood and thanked me for my honesty, a phrase that once would have felt like approval. Now it felt like a closing. He left without raising his voice and without asking again. After the door closed, my mother cried and then apologized for crying. I held her and did not promise what I could not give. That night, I slept without replaying conversations. The audacity had passed and taken its illusion with it. Would you have forgiven him? Consequences rarely announce themselves with finality. They settle into routines and relationships, altering the shape of days until the change feels permanent. After Richard left that afternoon, the house did not explode into arguments or declarations. It went quiet in a different way, a silence that did not ask to be filled. My mother moved through rooms as if measuring distance, touching the backs of chairs, straightening things that did not need straightening. She stopped asking how work was going and stopped offering opinions about weather or schedules. When she spoke, it was about groceries and appointments, the small logistics of keeping a household moving without addressing the fracture at its center. Silence became her compromise, a way to avoid choosing sides while living with the cost of not choosing at all. I learned to respect that silence without mistaking it for agreement. At work, I set boundaries that mirrored what I practiced at home. I declined conversations that drifted toward gossip and redirected discussions to process. When colleagues offered congratulations that sounded like relief, I thanked them and returned to the agenda. Justice had closed one chapter but opened another that required discipline of a different kind. The family gatherings that followed were shorter and more careful. Richard attended some and not others. When he did, he stayed on the edge of rooms, speaking only when spoken to, his authority reduced to politeness. My mother watched us both with a vigilance that felt like grief. I did not provoke or console. I kept my distance consistent and clear. Boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions for how to proceed without harm. I stopped sharing details of my work at home. I stopped seeking approval for choices that were already mine. When Richard attempted casual conversation, I responded with courtesy and nothing more. He tested the boundary once by suggesting we all move on. I replied that moving on requires direction, not erasure. He did not push again. My mother asked me privately if I could soften just a little for peace. I told her peace that requires silence from one side is not peace. She nodded and did not argue. The cost of the divide became visible in small ways. Holidays lost their rhythm, traditions thinned, the ease that comes from pretending differences do not exist disappeared. In its place was something harder and more honest. Choice. Each of us chose how to show up. I chose clarity. That choice carried weight. It meant accepting that my mother might never fully articulate her position and that Richard might never apologize in a way that named harm. It meant accepting that love does not entitle anyone to access. At work, the consequences were quieter and cleaner. The investigation had ended, but awareness lingered. Younger officers asked questions about gray areas, and I answered them with process and principle. I emphasized documentation and calm. I refused to be a symbol. I agreed to be a resource. The storm season returned, and with it the same risks. When I briefed my team, I reminded them that safety is not an abstraction and that procedure exists to serve people, not the other way around. I watched them absorb that without drama. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change in myself. The urge to explain receded. The need to be understood by family loosened its grip. I had learned that boundaries do not harden you, they free you from rehearsing arguments that go nowhere. My mother and I developed a new pattern, quieter but steadier. We spoke about practical things and shared meals without commentary. When she looked at me, I saw pride and worry braided together. I accepted both without trying to untangle them. Richard remained present and absent in equal measure. He no longer corrected me. He no longer claimed credit. He existed as a man adjusting to the loss of leverage. That adjustment was his work, not mine. The consequences reached beyond the house in subtle ways. Old acquaintances kept their distance. New ones approached with caution and curiosity. I learned to live with being known for something I did not seek and to refuse narratives that simplified it. The system had corrected itself. My task was to maintain my integrity afterward, which is harder than winning an argument. Boundaries require maintenance. They require consistency, even when it would be easier to blur them for comfort. I held mine with patience. When I looked back on the night of the storm, I did not romanticize it. I saw it as a moment that clarified values already present. The consequences that followed were not punishments. They were alignments. Family realigned. Authority realigned. My life realigned around a truth I no longer needed to defend. Healing did not arrive as relief so much as alignment, the quiet sense that my days finally matched my values without negotiation. I returned fully to work with a steadiness that surprised me, not because the job had changed, but because I had. The routines that once felt like armor now felt like tools. Briefings were concise, decisions were clean. I slept better knowing that the tension I carried for years had been named and set down. Logistics has a way of rewarding presence. You show up, you check the numbers, you anticipate weather and human error, and you adjust. I found comfort in that predictability and pride in mentoring younger officers who watched how calm spreads when leaders refuse theatrics. I did not tell them my story. I taught them process and principle. Winter receded, and spring brought the kind of storms that do not ask permission. Late one evening, months after the hearing, a new system rolled in off the water bands of rain sweeping the roads with familiar insistence. I was returning from a supply audit fatigue, humming but manageable, when I saw headlights falter ahead. A pickup had pulled onto the shoulder hazard's blinking hood, lifted like a question. The memory surfaced without panic this time. I slowed. I assessed. I stopped. The motions were the same and entirely different. I logged the time. I notified when safe. I checked on the driver, a single man shaking with cold and frustration. I offered a jacket and called for assistance. The rain drummed on the roof and the wind tugged at my sleeves. I felt no fear, only focus. Healing, I realized, is doing the same right thing without bracing for punishment. When help arrived and I pulled back onto the road, I noticed the absence of dread where it used to sit. The system had my back because I had done my part. At home, the house remained quiet, but no longer heavy. My mother and I shared coffee without rehearsing what not to say. She asked about my day and listened to the answer. When storms came, she worried aloud and trusted me to manage them. Richard existed at a distance that felt appropriate, no longer the axis around which choices turned. I did not measure my healing by his behavior. I measured it by my own. The redefinition was subtle and complete. Authority stopped meaning proximity and started meaning accountability. Family stopped meaning silence and started meaning boundaries honored. Courage stopped meaning confrontation and started meaning consistency. I began to see how many moments in my life had been shaped by the effort to avoid displeasing someone who mistook control for care. That effort had fallen away. In its place was a quieter confidence that did not need approval. At work, opportunities arrived without drama. A project required rebuilding supply routes after flooding, and I was asked to lead it because my name was associated with preparation rather than noise. The team worked late and laughed when mistakes were corrected quickly. The satisfaction was clean. When I drove home through rain afterward, I did not replay conversations or anticipate consequences. I watched the road and trusted my training. Healing is not forgetting. It is remembering without flinching. The storm that night passed like the others, leaving roads slick and air clear. I reached home and hung my jacket to dry. The porch light glowed without accusation. I realized then that fear had been the last thing to leave slipping out quietly when I was not watching. I had redefined what it meant to be steady, not unmoved, but unmoved from what matters. I have learned that endings are quieter than beginnings, not because they matter less, but because they no longer need to convince anyone. When I think back to the night on Route 58, I do not see rain first, or headlights, or the shape of fear. I see a choice made without witnesses and carried forward without apology. That is where honor lives, not in rooms where ranks are read aloud, not in titles etched on doors, but in the moments no one will ever audit unless you bring them forward yourself. Rank is a tool. It organizes effort and clarifies responsibility. It does not absolve you of conscience, and it does not grant you ownership of another person's judgment. I believed that before the storm. I understand it now. Silence used to feel like surrender. It feels different after you have learned to choose it. Silence can be a discipline, a way to let truth arrive intact instead of bruised by urgency. In my work, I still rely on systems and checklists, and the unglamorous math of getting things where they need to be. In my life, I rely on boundaries that do not argue and principles that do not bargain. The house I live in holds fewer voices now, but the air moves freely. My mother and I share what we can without asking one another to deny what we cannot. We have learned that love does not require agreement and that peace built on pretense is fragile. The distance I keep is not punishment, it is care for myself and clarity for others. I think often about how easily authority confuses itself with virtue, how quickly influence masquerades as wisdom when it goes unchallenged. I also think about how resilient systems can be when people refuse to perform and insist on record. Justice did not need my anger to function, it needed my patience. It needed my restraint. It needed my willingness to let process be slow and exact. I do not measure victory by what someone else lost. I measure it by what I did not have to give up to survive. I kept my integrity intact. I kept my work honest. I kept my voice for when it mattered. There will be other storms. There will be other nights when the road demands attention and judgment cannot be deferred. When those nights come, I will stop when stopping is right and move on when moving is required. I will document, notify, and proceed without fear. That confidence is not bravado. It is alignment. Honor is not loud. It does not ask for recognition. It waits for you in the space between impulse and action in the quiet where you decide who you are when no one is watching. If you have ever stood alone doing the right thing, this story is for you.